Let us bow. Gracious Holy One, we are in this space, a space that you have created for us as we come together to talk about how we have been abusers of your land, abusers of your children. But we're in this space to talk about how we can bring forth healing to the land and healing to your people. Our environment is a part of your creation as we are a part of the creation. We are the environment. So, in this space, I ask that all of the voices that will be spoken, that will speak tonight, will speak from their inner selves, that they will speak from their hearts, that they will give us the truth that needs to be heard in order that we take direction to change a system that can be changed. This earth was created for us to enjoy in collaboration and in harmony and in truth. Yet there are some who are not able to receive the benefits of clean air, clean water, food that is not contaminated by chemicals, housing, health. All of that is interconnected. And we are here this evening to talk about how we have racialized our environment and how we are able to come together to change it. Bless each speaker, give each and every one of us the voice of truth, the voice of compassion, and the voice of resolve. This is our opening prayer for us this evening as we begin to walk out how we're going to have a great healing in the land and the people in it. Ashe and Amen.
Amen. And thank you so much, Reverend Glency Redrick, for that wonderful opening prayer. Good evening. My name is Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler. I am pleased to join with you tonight as we have our 9th hearing for the Reimagining America Project, tonight focusing on the racialization of environmental health, a hearing on climate justice. We come together as the Reimagining America Project to say that it's been too long. It's been too long since we've been promised a conversation about race in America. It's been too long that people that live in Black and brown skin have had to suffer the indignities of living in a racialized system. It's been too long that we've all been subject to the indignities of race, of a hierarchy of humanity, with some being put above others, some being told that they are entitled to privilege, while others being told that they are forced to suffer because of the color of their skin. That's why we came together, because we believe as people that we need to do something about this, that this will not change simply by waiting on time, that we need, as Dr. King said, to come together as co-workers with God to bring about the kind of just world that we'd like to see. Tonight, we are pleased to have with us a number of different commissioners who will perform different roles for us tonight. We have, of course, the Mayor Jennifer Roberts, Reverend Dr. Sheldon Shipman, Ms. Samantha Turner, Attorney Bob Ward, Reverend Dr. Peter Wary, Reverend Brent Jones, Dr. Jim Beard, Reverend Greg Gerald, Mr. Attorney Joel Siegel, and you've already heard from Reverend Glency Redrick. As we come together tonight, we want to engage in a way that lifts up the value of every human being. We believe that truly people's stories have not been told. And if we can hear people's stories, learn from their narratives, we might begin to value every human being in our context. So as we listen to these stories tonight, I invite you to be open to hearing a word that you've never heard before, from someone whose voice you've never heard before, and appreciate the way that they are telling their own story about the way that race has impacted them. Often we don't recognize the fact that environmental and climate factors have a significant impact on Black and brown people, one that is actually disproportionate to their involvement in the system. They neither created the system in which we live, They neither perpetuated the terms under which we are forced to live in this environment with climate injustice, with environmental pollutants, but they're forced to live disproportionately with this brand of life in this racialized world. Well, we'll begin our conversation tonight with our first witness. Our first witness is an historical witness, one who will establish the racial history surrounding zoning, pollution of polluting industries, and divestment in Black and Brown communities. Our historical witness tonight, Ms. Daisha Williams, will be introduced by none other than Mayor Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer, I turn it over to you. God bless.
I'm Jennifer Roberts, and it is my honor to introduce our historic witness for this episode of the Reimagining America Project. And I am going to be introducing Daisha Williams. She has a Master's of Science in Environmental Policy from the Johns Hopkins University. We discovered we both have masters from there. And she has tremendous expertise in environmental policy and climate and environmental justice. She has been a stormwater specialist and educator. She was a legislative assistant to the Environmental Council in Seattle. She's also worked for a nonprofit that focuses on clean water in vulnerable communities. And she is currently the Environmental Justice Manager for Clean Air NC, which was formerly known as Clean Air Carolina, for those of you who do a lot of environmental work in North Carolina. She is going to give us a brief history of environmental racism and the need for environmental justice in North Carolina and in Charlotte. So Daisha, it's all yours, and you can share your screen with the slides you have. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And I'm going to show a few slides, and I'll also show them here in a bit. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak today on this very important issue of environmental justice. I'm sure many of you have heard the term in the news due to the major policy push for these issues at our state level and federal level, or you may have heard it come up from attending similar webinars and panels which focus on it. So in this way, environmental justice has become sort of a buzzword, if you will, but it's more than that. It's a concept that rolls in equal protection, equal access, equal enforcement. So it's not a buzzword. It's not a fuzzy issue. It's an issue of the right to live in a neighborhood that's not overpolluted, to live somewhere where your kids can play outside, not next to a refinery or a chemical plant, and without the risk of developing a health condition because of the quality of your environment. And even though it's a concept that's becoming more mainstream, it's something that communities of color have been fighting for generations. And to understand environmental justice and the movement, it's definitely worth looking back at the event that helped launch it in the first place. And I like to bring this up because it was birthed here in our state. So we have sort of an obligation to continue this work. So like I mentioned, communities of color, they have been mobilizing and fighting for years, but the start of the EJ movement, many point to 1982, when North Carolina had announced a plan to move extremely harmful soil contaminated with PCBs from alongside our state's roadsides because it became hazardous. So they decided to move it to a landfill located in Warren County, which at the time and still has a majority Black population. And the decision, it triggered a wave of protests, one of which resulted in the arrest of a US congressman, dozens of faith leaders and other activists who laid in the street to block the trucks from coming into the county. And unfortunately, all this effort that the residents put in, they lost the battle still, unfortunately. And North Carolina buried the PCBs in the county, and it's a decision that still impacts the community today. But the controversy crystallized the idea that the nation's environmental problems are disproportionately burdening its low-income people of color. And so shortly after this, In 1987, the United Church of Christ, through its Commission for Racial Justice, prepared a report called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, and it provided the concrete evidence that had so far been lacking. So the church's researchers found that race was more strongly correlated with the placement of a hazardous waste facility than any other single factor, and it remained so even when they controlled for income and geographic areas. So from these findings, the church ministers coined the phrase environmental racism, and the UCC did a 20-year update and found that little to no change happened within these trends. And environmental justice advocates and environmental justice communities have shown time and time again that this is no accident. Communities of color, which are often low income, are routinely targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts. So we're talking about landfills, dirty industrial plants, and in North Carolina specifically, a huge concern is that of concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, which bring a host of environmental and health problems to communities in Eastern North Carolina. And within these occurrences, the statistics provide clear evidence of environmental racism, which has stemmed from practices such as redlining that have shaped the experiences of minorities in this country. So for those who may not know about it, redlining began in the mid-20th century, and it was the practice of cities blocking off entire neighborhoods of color in a way that put services out of reach for residents. So government planners in many municipalities, including here in Charlotte, drew redlining maps that identified Black and Latino neighborhoods as undesirable and unworthy of housing loans and investment. And this federal disinvestment, sanctioned by our state and federal agencies from these neighborhoods, meant lower property values, making these communities more attractive to projects like highways and industrial sites that required a lot of cheap land. And these practices were banned under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but its legacy has remained through fixed segregation, economic inequality, lack of public services to redline communities, as well as one of the main issues I focus on within my work as an environmental justice manager for clean air, which is air quality deterioration from urban highways, industrial plants, landfills, and all of these facilities that I just mentioned. And this trend is relevant across the United States, but just to bring it home here to Mecklenburg County, sorry, is my screen good?
There you go. Yep, sharing is on.
So just to bring it home, like I said, in Charlotte, much of the West Side has suffered from a history of redlining that kept businesses and loans out of these areas for decades, while making these communities target for highway corridor construction. So if you're from Charlotte, you may have heard of the crescent and the wedge, and it represents a persistent pattern which highlights the longstanding pattern of race, income, and wealth that shapes much of the city. So the wedge is made up of affluent neighborhoods stretching from uptown to South Charlotte and into suburban areas. And then this wedge is surrounded by a crescent of higher poverty neighborhoods to the west and north. And this geographical pattern is due to redlining. So I have these maps here just to illustrate this visually and historically. So Charlotte's 1935 redlining disinvestment map that you see on the far left shows areas in red and yellow where financial institutions did not make home loans or any other kinds of community investments. And you can begin to see what I just explained of Charlotte's poverty crescent created in major part of redlining in the 30s and 40s. And these inequities continue to show up in health disparities. So if you look at the middle map, rates of unemployment, access to fresh and healthy food, from 2012 to 2016 are limited in these neighborhoods. And finally, Charlotte's redlining map on the far right just shows that this practice continues to plague these communities well into 2020 and beyond, where most of our county's poverty falls within these historical areas of disinvestment. So these historical racist practices, like I said, have given rise to many injustices in an environmental justice community such as West End Charlotte. The concentration of industry, highway traffic, and other activities in the area puts residents at risk for health problems caused by breathing in polluted air. So just as an example, I-85 and I-87 I-77, which experiences hundreds of diesel trucks that pass through the area every day. And this is according to our DOT, borders much of the West End. And as you can see from the bottom left map, in addition to this, there's also a quarry that's centrally located in the West End called the Martin Marietta Quarry, which contributes to a host of other air quality issues resulting from quarry activities such as drilling, as well as increased concentration of diesel trucks that are coming in and out of the site. I like to give this example just because I saw this for myself. I went to the Martin Marietta Quarry with a community leader about a month and a half ago. And we were there for about 10 minutes and I counted 36 trucks coming to and from the quarry, diesel trucks. So that's trucks that are just constantly passing through the neighborhoods and contributing to the air quality problem. So these issues build upon each other. It's not just that a quarry is located there, it's the activities that bring people to the quarry that just contributes to these problems. But in general, the historic West End also has a higher concentration of factories, waste sites, and other large emitters of harmful air pollution than anywhere else in our county. And the effects of air pollution are severe. So for low-income communities and communities of color, the dangers of exposure to environmental hazards are exacerbated, because you're combining economic disadvantage, dangerous air pollution, other types of pollutions, and you're putting it in communities that don't have the resources to address the health impact associated with these practices. So these communities find themselves at greater risk for cancer, other health consequences. Many of the things that you see here on this slide are a lot of the health impacts of air pollution. And now as we face the pandemic, poor air quality has become even more of an urgent concern because many of the health conditions that you see here on this slide have also been shown to increase the risk of death from COVID-19. And we see this reflected in communities that have been hit hardest by COVID. So if you've been following the news, you see that people of color are dying disproportionately from this awful virus compared to their white counterparts. So I'm just gonna stop again just to talk with you face to face. But as you can tell, this is an issue that goes beyond a mainstream buzzword or concept, if you will, like I mentioned at the beginning. And I say this because the age we're living in with social media and all the other platforms have brought these issues to the forefront. And we saw this last summer with the death of George Floyd. Everyone was fired up and Black Lives Matter became the main topic of conversation on the internet and amongst people. And within this, others were also bringing attention to other areas of racism besides police brutality and opening up their eyes to the many ways that Black Americans and other Americans of color are treated in this country. And as it died out, and of course, as COVID came, I personally saw less and less about Black Lives Matter and social inequalities. I saw less people trying to learn and even people expressing that they were tired of hearing about it. But that's a privileged perspective because even when these concepts fall out of mainstream conversations, it's still a lived in reality for communities of color, and they're constantly fighting against systems that don't support them. So with that, I just want to end this mini hearing testimony to implore you to just continue to fight for this, continue to put this at the forefront. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to that person you hear in passing that may say something discriminatory, educate people. And within that, we also have to make sure we're putting pressure on our decision makers to pass and hold the line on environmental justice issues. We have to keep this concept alive so we can keep our communities alive.
Wow, Deja, I want to thank you for that really powerful presentation. You packed a lot into those minutes, and you remind me of myself. I get talking really fast when I'm excited about something and passionate, and you are truly passionate about it. So thank you so much. We're so lucky to have you as an educator in our community. And I think you answered my second question was going to be what can any individual do, but I'd like to ask you. What, in terms of our policy in Charlotte and in North Carolina, what are a couple of like the top priorities for ways, because one of the things that Reimagining America Project is going to do is to present ideas to policymakers that come out of this testimony and now these hearings. What are some of the priorities, top two priorities or three priorities that our policymakers can do to change the story of environmental racism?
Yeah, that's something really important and something that we should always be focused on, not only just in environmental justice issues, but all issues that impact us as a society, just holding our elected officials accountable. And that's why I think the two questions intercept. So, what can we do as an individual and what can we do with policy? Because our decision makers, they represent us, they represent their constituencies. Um, and, just as far as redlining goes, it's evidence that our institutions have residual racism. And it's a system that favors some members of a community and disfavor others. And just as an example, people who speak the dominant language, people who speak English, people who have the time, people who have the money and the power to contact, or people that have the education to contact a government staff person to, just as an example, get their sidewalks fixed or get their roads repaired or their lights changed first, or address the stormwater impacts or the air quality impacts in their community. Those are the people that get these things fixed, just being there within the decision-making arena and having your voice heard is super, super important, and letting your decision makers know that you're aware of these issues. So, I mentioned the Martin Marietta Quarry and the other various industries that have placed themselves within the historic West End. And when these facilities locate themselves somewhere, they typically have to go through permitting processes, which solicit public input, and it's also based on zoning. So showing up to these permitting hearings, showing up to these zoning hearings, and all these other potential opportunities for public input, it makes the city know that you're paying attention to what is and has played out in our city. And also just contacting other officials that may have a place in this. So urging that local health department to get involved to try and understand more about health impacts in the historic West End, come up with a plan. But yeah, just finding the different ways. And I know that's not as specific, but yeah, just educating yourself and finding those little pockets of public opportunity to just urge your decision makers to really make this at the forefront, because we'll never be successful in our movement for a healthy, safe, and sustainable environment for all of us if we don't intentionally and actively fight to dismantle racism in all of its forms and to speak out for those that have been historically disadvantaged and continue to be disadvantaged by our systems.
Thank you so very much. That was a wonderful testimony. I really wish I could be with Miss Deja Williams right now just to tell her how great that was, how thorough it was. Our next type of witness are the impacted witnesses. And impacted witnesses are the kind that will tell stories about the impact of race, racism, or instances of racial disparity on their own lives and the larger communities in which they live. This is significant because they will help us to be sensitive to the fact that being racialized as Black and Brown in this context has an impact on your life. The Reverend Glency Redrick will introduce us to our first witness, Miss Ebony Lockett. Reverend Redrick. We can't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I do have something for membership. Oh, I'm sorry.
I have the pleasure of introducing Ebony Lockett. Ebony Lockett has a master's degree in education and is passionate about her civil rights and social action, economic empowerment, education, health, and social services. A CMS English teacher since 2007, she founded Harvesting Humanity in 2018, whose mission is to innovate and execute holistic integrated science, technology, reading and writing, engineering, arts, architecture, and mathematics curricular and experiences to engage, prepare, and position diverse local, national, and global solutionaries. Hear ye, Ebony Lockhart, our impacted witness.
Thank you, Reverend Redrick, for that introduction. And when deciding how to begin the telling of my environmental justice story, I had to cocoon myself in that familial love which cradled me, arms that were sculpted by decades of digging and sowing and weeding and harvesting, yet rarely reaping anything but a migrant worker's misery and an immigrant farmer's destiny. Those are my humble beginnings. I remember vividly my grandmother telling me stories of Belglade, Florida, her family history as migrant farm workers, some of that life they lived and experienced. I had to be held in the humble hearts of griots before me like her. I had to hear their words whispering through the winds, to be reminded of the Sankofa principle, of going back to move forward. So I will take you back. I will take you back to my elementary school days. I will take you back to the Mayas that were interwoven throughout our adjourning projects, serving as separate grade level schoolhouses for South Arsenal Neighborhood Development Schools, also known to us who attended as Sands Everywhere Elementary School, in the capital city of Hartford, state of Connecticut. I will take you back to that summer just after 6th grade when some of us were at the cusp of saying goodbye to childhood innocence and being thrust gleefully or otherwise into adolescence. I will take you back to that summer just after 6th grade when some of us had lost our childhood innocence long before the traumas of that time. I will take you back to that summer just after 6th grade when some of us were playing at the school/neighborhood playground situated in the middle of Sands Everywhere Elementary School, Sands high-rise residential project, Bellevue Square's concrete housing project, and our intersecting Main Street. I will take you back to that summer just after 6th grade when our schoolmate Sandra collapsed and died while a group of us played at that park. We had all known that Sandra suffered from asthma, but we had never expected that it would claim her life. There were a lot of us who intimately or domestically or tangentially dealt with asthma, so it didn't seem like such an unusual chronic condition or a particularly deadly one. Consequences often skewed at that age because right there on the grassy banks of our school neighborhood playground, Sandra collapsed and died, and we had never seen it coming. It was many minutes before the paramedics arrived, and I still do not recall, even after a few phone calls to family and childhood friends, I still do not recall the precise hour of the day or who called the paramedics, or who all the other players were in the subsequent series of events. Maybe my limited recollection is my mind's way of shielding my heart from moments of this memory, but what will never be erased, what remains most seared in my mind's eye, is Sandra's open blouse and lifeless body. The paramedics' pumps frantically trying to revive her, and the desperate grief on her father's face at her memorial service. To learn later in life that this and other tragedies connected to the built environments in which we live, work, play, and worship are disproportionately and many times intentionally designed and allocated to disregard the health and wellness of some and prioritize the health and wellness of others. To learn this inconvenient truth rocked me to the core. The US Department of Health and Human Services report that non-Hispanic African Americans are 40% more likely to have asthma than non-Hispanic whites in 2018. We are talking in the year 2018. In 2019, they reported that non-Hispanic Black children had a death rate 8 times that of non-Hispanic white children. And we ask ourselves about those disparities. We asked ourselves how in 2019 we are still fighting the same fight: clean air, environments that do not depend on what color your skin is or how much money is in your savings account. To learn that the location and design of our adjoining projects, our neighborhood schools, the railroads that separated us from prosperity, and the dump that made its home about 4 minutes driving distance from our backyards. To learn that all that represented the value placed on our majority Black and brown lungs, our lived experiences, and our overall health and wellness, or dare I say, the lack thereof. To learn that the most basic human rights, healthy food and healthy air, are denied again and again and again. To learn this devalued proposition set for Black and brown and Indigenous lives again and again and again. To learn this set me on a crusade for environmental justice, which permeates and propels both my professional and my personal work to this day. Almost 40 years later, and the more things change, the more they stay the same. Largely Black and brown and rural poor frontline and fence line communities across our city, across our county, across our nation, across our world, increasingly suffer from the fruits of the poisonous trees of redlining, disinvestment, proximity to polluting plants and toxic runoffs, subpar water and waste systems, and the list goes on. Largely Black and brown and rural poor lives are minimized in value and worth and easily desecrated and discarded. To move forward, we must not only learn the lessons of our ancestral griots taught to us, but we must also learn from the historically racist, immoral, and unjust policies and practices that helped to get us to this disastrous place. And we must use those lessons to chart a new path forward for our planet and for its people, particularly and especially for those communities most impacted by the harms of environmental injustice, like the one I spent my formative years navigating, and the one that ultimately claimed the lives, health, and well-being of Sandra and so many others, including the migrant, immigrant, and Indigenous upon whose shoulders we stand. Thank you.
We will now have questions from Reverend Glency Redrick. Thank you so much for your testimony, Epine.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for engaging us this evening. So yes, I have 3 questions that I'd like to ask of you, Ebony, and can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just well.
Okay, and let me come on camera. You have been helping educate the public about EJ communities throughout the North Carolina Climate Ambassador Program. What moved you to be a part of this?
Humanity, just my hope and belief in humanity. Of course, my lived experience, my humble beginnings, my ancestry. Again, I'll drop a link in the chat, but there's CBS did a special years ago on what I learned was a family member of mine, Thomas Lockett. And Thomas would have been my great uncle. I believe I got that lineage right, but don't quote me on that part of it, but he was definitely a family member. And they tell about the life of the migrant farmers who moved from Belglade to this place, and there was such a diverse group of people, but understanding that I had a responsibility, that in my bloodline, there was a responsibility to do this work, I couldn't say no. I couldn't say no.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. When it is in the bloodline, we can't ignore it and we do have to respond. And so I thank you for the work that you are doing. If you are ready for me to ask you
Oh,
the second
absolutely.
question. Okay. So how do you see the connection between our environment and our health?
So I spent the whole day today with Leadership Charlotte as a member of class of 43, and our whole day today was about healthcare. We were able to lift up the powerful work of Dr. Ophelia Garman Brown, and that just connects to my response to that second question, because it is, you know, without the right food to eat, without the right air to breathe, without the right environment to thrive, we don't exist. And so like that connection is so intimate, you know, and it just played out today again and again in every conversation. We had a few doctors on the line. We had several clinicians that work in the mental health space and the social service space, and everyone said the same thing. This is a public health crisis because all of these intersecting facets of life and the intersectionality of the way that we live, we work, we play, we worship, those are things we can't dissect and we can't worry about in silos. We've got to have a comprehensive plan for it.
Okay, thank you. If you could prioritize one aspect of policy to change to begin to counter this environmental racism, what would that be? What would that one thing be?
I think I would have to go with monetary reparations.
Okay.
Administering monetary reparations so that we really start to work to closing the racial wealth gap, because all of these things, you know, even the income, when we talk about income levels and economic empowerment, the sad truth is that's a resource that's needed as well in this fight. And so with an opportunity to, you know, own more homes and the opportunity to actually have access and be able to pay for better health care. All of those things would kind of be alleviated if we start to narrow, if we start to, you know, really, really work on narrowing those gaps.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for just showing your love for the work. You have touched, I know, my heart, and I'm sure the heart of others that are listening. And I look forward to seeing you out there doing more of the work. Blessings.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Samantha Turner, who will be our affirming commissioner. Samantha.
Hello, and thank you so much for your testimony, Ms. Lockett. I've heard a lot of testimony, but it's not testimony. I'm sorry. I've heard so much data on environmental injustice, but the story you told, wow. I've never heard a story about children watching their friend die in front of them, like you said, by design. When I think about you saying going back to move forward, I think about the fact that Charlotte was founded by colonists. It wasn't founded, it was colonized in the mid 1700s. So we know that this city was built by enslaved people. We know that they built the beautiful city that we live in, and they deserve the best parts of it. I agree completely that we need reparations and we need to end racist environmental practices. I'm an activist, and I will amplify your story in my community and mobilize people in my own community to take serious and impactful action against these racist environmental practices that are sickening and killing Black and brown people in so many ways. This crescent and wedge goes back to the beginning of the building of the city, and it was definitely by design. And I feel your hope. I too am a humanist. I am counting on humanity to get us out of this. And I'm doing the work with you, and I stand with you, and I cannot stop either. So thank you so much for your testimony.
Amen. Thank you, Samantha, for your response there. Thank you, Ebony, for your testimony, and Reverend Glency for serving as our introducer in chief and also for our questioner. As we move on, we're going to hear from Ms. Nikisha Glover, our next witness, the founder of Soul Nation and a wonderful local activist. She'll be introduced by Mayor Jennifer Roberts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Roberts, and it is my honor today to introduce you to a leader in the environmental justice and climate justice area here in Charlotte, and that is Nikisha Glover. She has been active for a number of years in helping tell the story of environmental justice and environmental racism. She has served as the regional director for the League of Conservation Voters. She's been the climate justice organizer for the Hip Hop Caucus, still doing that, and also has worked with Girls Who Code. So she's got the technology piece as well. She has a Bachelor in Science from UNC Charlotte. She's also been a volunteer in groups like the Moms Clean Air Force and Greenpeace, but her big accomplishment is founding Soul Nation, and that's spelled S-O-L Nation, in 2018. It's described on the website as Black thought leaders who are closing the green gap and placing people of color at the core of the environmental justice work. And so it is my honor to introduce you to Nikisha and to hear her story of environmental racism and the justice that she's working for. Nikisha, great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me today, Jennifer. And thank you for the lovely introduction. To be a meaningful impact in my heart. And when I was able to find my next opportunity, it actually came in the form of an opportunity that I didn't realize would be what would set me on a trajectory to understand the work towards advocating for our communities and advocating for justice, and specifically environmental justice in our communities. That path would lead me to learn of the environmental movement overall. But what I would learn in the environmental movement space is that there are forms of disparity and injustice there as well. What I've come to know is that some of our big green organizations, the environmental movement itself is a movement of many different organizations, but the mainstream movement is well funded and it's white led. In this white led movement, it gets a lot of funding, but yet we have communities that are continuously harmed by the injustices of pollution, the injustices of they're harmed by the injustices of pollution. They're harmed by the disparities of access to clean water. They are disparaged because of different environmental factors that become cumulative impacts. And these cumulative factors really take a toll on people's lives. And so navigating further into the work of in the environmental space, I knew for me that I needed to land somewhere where I was able to make the connections between the environmental movement and the social justice movement, because we understand that the environmental movement and the social justice movement both need each other. And the issue there arises because the same communities that are typically Black and Brown, that are on the bottom of every environmental impact list that you can think of, are the same communities that are on the bottom of the list of our social issues. When we talk about the digital divides, or we talk about housing access or food security, we talk about education, like all of these different things, they have a face and a color to them. And that face and color typically looks like mine. Black and brown communities are most likely impacted by environmental threats and most likely impacted by social threats as well. And so while I wasn't finding that in some of the earlier work in my path, I was able to ultimately navigate to a place where I could really do this deep, impactful, meaningful work for climate justice through Soul Nation. And to your point, Soul Nation is a climate justice solutions-based organization where we are really truly committed to closing the green gap that exists for our communities. We believe that communities should own their own solutions. We believe that that we need to create those pathways and entry points for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to be able to be active participants in the environmental justice movement. We also believe that we should really create the access for communities to be able to lead and participate in the socioeconomic decision making and development to create their own sustainable and sovereign communities. I'm going to talk about climate and environment as a whole. We're seeing the mainstream media talk about one, they're using the word climate. We had a whole administration that was denying the impacts of climate. So we do have in more spaces where people are using the terms in the ways in which and connecting it to the ways that it's impacting our everyday lived experience. So we are connecting the colonial pipeline oil spill that's getting that's getting local attention. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there's an opportunity for there to be mainstream media attention on something like that when we know that everybody now knows what colonial pipeline is, because we were all impacted by the ransomware attack that they were under earlier this year. And so being able to connect the dots between not only have we been impacted because of failures of their infrastructure to prevent the ransomware attacks, there also is the failure of their infrastructure because we know that pipelines leak. And typically pipelines are leaking most often in Black and brown communities, specifically in Indigenous communities as well. And it threatens our access to clean water. And so that I think those are the opportunities where we're seeing the opportunity to really leverage those moments and create more dialogue around these issues as not being something that that just fell out the sky from nowhere. No, all of the issues, from the respiratory disease, the asthma, the cancers, many of these things have a root back to the pollution that is invading our communities.
So Nikisha, it's unusual for a woman and a person of color to head an environmental organization. And I know that, you know, you've got to talk to business leaders, et cetera, in your role. Do you find that you're treated any differently because of who you are?
You know, I think representing my community, I think there have been times where it does present itself as challenges, and it really comes down to it when we talk about the work that we're doing in our communities. Black-led organizations working on climate and Black people working on climate and environmental issues are underfunded, under-resourced, and overburdened by the issues that pertain to the environmental and climate space. And yet they are the most far away from really being able to have that access to the resources, the infrastructure, the education, and the power to make change. Yet they're the closest to the issues. And so while I may be making progress I, as an individual, may be making progress, the larger community is not, because there is a hoarding of the access to those things that I mentioned, a hoarding of the access to the infrastructure, the education, the power, and the resources. When we know that communities who have been most impacted by environmental threats are the closest to the solutions and should be resourced in a way in which they can be able to own their own solutions for their communities. And so, yes, it may seem at times that I'm able to make progress, but that's been a journey, Jennifer. Like the journey of getting to a place where Soul Nation does have some funding, we are able to hire some staff. It doesn't compare to the larger organizations that are gaining multi-year, multi-million dollars in funding. And we need more organizations that are led by people who look like me and look like the communities in which Soul Nation is serving and represented in. We need more of those communities to be represented in the spaces that can actually put forth that transformational change, where they can be able to really see sustainable and regenerative communities that they desire. We all desire to live in sustainable and regenerative communities, but some people in our community have more access to the things to generate those sustainable and regenerative communities.
So if there were one or two things that you would put at the top of the list to change right now to help communities that have been impacted, communities of color that have been impacted, and to change the racism inherent in the way that we deal with the environment, what would those priorities be?
I think I'm gonna sum it up in those four buckets that I mentioned, because that's also the way that we define green gap. So let me actually take a minute to define green gap. I think for us, like, the focus should be on closing the green gap. And at Soul Nation, we define green gap as the difference between Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities' desire to build and live in sustainable, regenerative communities, and their access to the resources, the power, the education, and the infrastructure to achieve those communities. So no matter what policy that we're talking about, no matter what resources we're talking about, what it comes down to is being able to identify those gaps where they exist and being able to close the gaps by creating more pathways to resources. Some of us that may be watching today, you have access to, and you have not only access, you may have an overabundance of resources and power and infrastructure and education that we need to figure out, how do we redistribute those things so that communities can really be able to stand on their own and be able to have the clean air and the clean water, and the infrastructure in their communities to really thrive, and be able to also take part as active participants in the transition that we're making, as we're divesting from fossil fuels and old technologies that have harmed our communities, and we're making more investments into clean energy and infrastructure, really being able to have communities who have been most harmed be able to most benefit from the trajectory that we're on, for a more cleaner, renewable economy.
Well, Nikisha, you've been tremendous today. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your passion and all the work that you're doing for our communities of color, because we know they have been harmed, and it's in all of our desires and best interests to help close that, as you call it, the green gap, and to help people be more aware of how they can be part of that. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so very much. Wonderful to hear from you, Nikisha Glover, and Jennifer Roberts. Thank you so much for your questioning of her. Our affirming witness tonight for Nikisha will be none other than Joel Siegel. Joel Siegel, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Happy holidays. It's great to see Nikisha. I remember I met her at UNCC when she was working for a national green organization, and I felt her spirit and her warmth. And as I got to talk to her, I realized I was dealing with a very brilliant woman who I thought would become a major leader in the climate change space. And I think I was right. And I invited her to New York City for the Justice Action Mobilization Network National Conference. And I was blown away by her, I'll just say her genius, and also her spirituality. What Nikisha's been saying about African-American environmental groups being underfunded, I have heard this repeatedly over the last several years. Reverend Leo Woodbury in Florence, South Carolina, what he tells me is that most of the money goes to the green organizations, the larger green organizations. But I think there has to be a sea change in terms of where the funding goes. And Nikisha's right. There's no reason why organizations like Soul Nation, I remember when she first launched Soul Nation, should be resourced, to the maximum degree. Out west, I just came back from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Out west, the people suffering the most from climate change are the Latino farmers and farmers from ethnic communities. They can't get water from their wells because the aquifers have dried up. So Nikisha, thank you for your honesty. And I am so glad that Nikisha's in this world, because we have one real fighter for social justice, environmental justice, and humanity. She's also one of the nicest persons that I've ever known.
Thank you so much, Joel Siegel. I appreciate your words of support for Nikisha Glover and her work. Our next speaker is Mr. Lawrence Tolliver, who will bear witness. Introducing him is none other than Reverend Glency Redrick.
Good evening again. I have the great pleasure of introducing Lawrence Tolliver. He is the former vice president of the Chamber of Commerce and the former secretary of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Development Corporation, where he worked on the redevelopment of land currently known as City West Commons Shopping Center and the Wilkinson Park Business Center. He is the current chair of the board of Peace Centers International and has been engaged with Peace Centers since its founding in 2011. A resident of Charlotte, he has been active in tracking the huge pipeline spill in Mecklenburg County by Colonial Pipeline last year, and is an active climate champion with 350.org Charlotte and Green Faith Charlotte. Not only is he doing such great things, but Lawrence Tolliver and I go way back to Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, and it is great to see you. I present you Lawrence Tolliver.
Thank you so much, Reverend Glency. It's wonderful to be with you in this purpose that we have this evening. And I am honored that I've been asked by Mayor Roberts to participate. I don't have, how can I say it, the eloquence of Ebony, but I do have some direct experiences that I want to share with those who are participating in this program this evening. I grew up in a northern town, a town named Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. Aliquippa, Pennsylvania is a small town that really was a company town. The name of the company that owned Aliquippa is Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation. Jones and Laughlin entered the Western Pennsylvania area to invest in the building of steel mills. And they found a tract of land that was 5.5 miles long. It bordered the Ohio River. Some of you may know that the Ohio River begins in Pittsburgh and it moves north. And 18 miles up the river is Aliquippa. Aliquippa is a company town, as certainly was a company town in its formation. And that formation took place during World War I. So we're talking about over 100 years ago. Jones and Laughlin formed a land development company, which was responsible for building the town. And what they did is that they laid out a number of plans. So there was plan 1, plan 2, plan 3, that kind of a thing. And the residential units were built by the company on those plans. Well, Plan 11 extension is the plan where Black men and women made their homes and brought up their children. Also, there was a project. It was called Griffith Heights. Griffith Heights was the site where my mother and father began their family. And this was back in the 1940s. So we're talking about a long time ago. I was born in 1943. And the real serious part about this story I want you to understand is that the whole redlining history of America was in fact adopted and used to create the various plans within Aliquippa so that some people lived at Plan 12, other people Plan 11, other people Plan 11 extension. The interesting thing about Plan 11 extension is that it was right beside the landfill. We didn't call it a landfill, we call it a dump. And when I say right beside, I do mean that, because the dump trucks had to drive through Plan 11 extension in order to get to the landfill to drop the trash. So they bordered one another. The swimming pool that we used, the public swimming pool that we used, was not that far from this landfill. So the other thing I want you perhaps to remember is that in the 40s and the 50s, the steel mills in Pennsylvania, the ones around Pittsburgh and Aliquippa, those steel mills polluted the air every day, 24 hours a day. When people would hang their laundry out for it to dry, they discovered often that soot particulates would cling to the clean clothes that were hanging on the line. It took, 15 years for all of that contamination of the air to be controlled, contained, and reduced. But not before 3 of my 7 brothers and sisters experienced a great deal of asthma. I personally can remember the nights my mother was walking the floor, holding on to one of my brothers or sisters, helping them to make it through the night, helping them to breathe by holding them and walking them throughout the night. Otherwise, they couldn't have made it. They couldn't have slept. They couldn't have breathed. So I know that the proximity of the steel mill, it was a cause of the asthma. The air was totally contaminated, and every day more contamination was poured into the air. So I am fortunate that I don't have the story to tell that Ebony told. My brothers and sisters survived, thank God. Now, there is another story that I want to tell, and this has to do with Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been here since 1985, and I began working for the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce that year. But just around 1998, an idea was brewed that we could form a nonprofit development company that could assemble land in the inner city and bring that land back up to par and create opportunities for businesses to move in and to prosper in these neighborhoods. Both were West Side neighborhoods. One was on Wilkinson Boulevard, and one was at the intersection of Remount Road and West Boulevard. We went into those projects with assistance from the state, the federal government, from the city council, and from the county commissioners. And they all poured in what ended up being over $7 million for the purposes of assembling the land and creating an opportunity for businesses to invest in those inner city areas. That investment did take place. Furthermore, the city of Charlotte decided that they would locate a new police substation at the City West Commons shopping center at Remount and West Boulevards. So there was a great coming together of people, and I do have to name the person who took the lead in getting the money raised and overseeing the way the project unfolded, and that was John Crosland Jr. It was my pleasure to serve with him in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Development Corporation. We did great work. We reclamated 33 acres on Wilkinson Boulevard, and shortly after we began to assemble the land, the Walmart superstore cat a corner from us began to come out of the ground. But we took the lead by addressing the worst properties along Wilkinson Boulevard. It did take leadership. And I'm going to just suggest that talking about issues like this is one thing, but getting your arms around the issue, developing a plan and implementing it with the assistance of a public-private partnership is the way in which to bring about the massive changes in the inner cities that we're talking about. How can I say, the dilapidated, polluting uses of lands near residences of African Americans and other colored populations, all of that can be addressed with public-private partnerships. And I just truly do suggest that this organization, Reimagining America, begin to identify the people who can, in fact, make that happen. It's happened before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tolliver, for your testimony. We will now have questions, a question or two from Reverend Glency Redrick, after which we'll have our affirming witness for you tonight, Mr. Bob Ward. Reverend Redrick.
Yes, thank you, Brother Tolliver, for your powerful storytelling. And the questions that I have, you have really pretty much answered those questions for us. So I'm going to kind of alter the first question because you shared your realizing growing up, near the steel factory, that it was bad for your family's health. But did anyone else growing up happen to see what you saw or experience the tragedies as a result of being right near the dump? You were saying that plan 11 extension was literally right next to a landfill. And then you also had the backdrop of the steel factories. So you and your family were blessed not to incur illnesses, with the exception of your brother who had sounds like asthmatic
Yes,
conditions.
yeah, yeah.
But
Three
who
of them
else
asthma.
could you? Who else would you be able to identify experience such harm as related to being located in those environments?
Well, let me just say this, Reverend Glency. As a kid, I wasn't paying that much attention to
Right.
problems. I was playing and I was getting good grades and I was singing. I was living the life. I felt very bad for my brothers and sisters who had the asthma, uh, but I wasn't a deep thinker at that time. I wasn't mobilized at that time, so I can't name specific people. I do know other people had asthma in our communities. And I do know that, this contamination, the contamination, all of the particulates in the air affected the entire company town of Aliquippa.
Okay. And so thank you for that. And the second question for us, you spoke of the economic harm that comes from polluted and toxic soil and industrial sites that are located in low income communities. Do you think that people are aware that this is a form of environmental racism?
No, I don't believe people are connecting the dots. I was happy to hear that Nikisha is busy educating the various markets and communities and neighborhoods and being a strong advocate for them. But I don't believe that people can do much more than make sure that there is food on the table and to try their best to keep their boys alive. I think that those two issues dominate the thinking of every family in every Black neighborhood in this country, because it's a perilous time for our boys. And I cannot imagine a lot of folk have time to focus on environmental issues and environmental racism.
Okay. May I ask just one other question? Because yes, I totally agree that the families who are working hard to keep food on the table may not be recognizing it. But what about those corporations and entities that are building in communities that are clearly unhealthy? They get all of the planning maps, so they know exactly what they're doing. Do you think they are connecting the dots?
I know that City Hall and the County Hall are addressing the issues. They know it's happening. They cannot hide from it. What they are not doing is requiring these corporations that are using public monies, they are not requiring them to be totally, how can I say, responsible in their investments and in their location activities. And so we are not seeing the kind of new investments and commitments to change the things that have gone wrong. And when the soil gets so contaminated that you have to dig it up and take it someplace else, which is what we had to do on Wilkinson Boulevard and what we had to do at Remount. We had to remove the soil because it couldn't hold up anything. We couldn't build there with that soil. We had to go get good soil. And so I know that there is more that can be done by the governor and by local elected officials to make sure that people who use the public money use it properly and in a corrective manner, meaning go back to the places that were destroyed, fix them up, invest there.
Thank you so much for that response. And once again, it was great seeing you. And I turn it back over to Rodney. Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
And I'll turn it over to Attorney Ward. Bob?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Tolliver, for your very compelling testimony, and beg to differ. You. I also want to, I'd like to affirm, first of all, the hurt that that your family experienced. I know that people, when they go through challenges, they're able to sort of meet that challenge, rise to it. But the very fact that you had to go through that is an injustice. It is something that should not have happened at many levels. I have a particular empathy or compassion for you and your family in this situation, because I grew up with asthma. I know what it's like to not be able to breathe. And I can't imagine what that would be like to find out that in some respects, it was by design that this was going to happen. And that's wrong. I mean, it's just this, and this is a moral imperative, I think, for us, for our country, to make amends, to right these wrongs. And I want to affirm also your success in doing that. I mean, you came here to Charlotte and became very successful at what you did, and working in those areas made tremendous impact. And I believe that that's the type of thing that we do need to follow. And also, I want to affirm your wisdom. I think you have I gather you've got a real strong sense of this, these issues. Certainly, they're nuanced aspects, and also they're very present and apparent aspects that they're there. I hope very much that we can look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much for your comments this evening. They are duly noted. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Mr. Tolliver, for all that you have done, all you said tonight. Thank you so much for Reverend Glency for your introduction and questioning. And Bob Ward, I thank you so much for your affirmation. And I just have to lament the fact that you've got a much longer white beard than I do now. Thank you so much. Our next speaker, our next witness for tonight is the Reverend Dr. Sheldon Shipman. He will be introduced by the Reverend Dr. Peter Wary, after which he will have an affirmation by none other than Reverend Brent Jones. I turn it over to you, Dr. Wary.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler, and thank you, Mr. Tolliver, for that compelling testimony. It has been very bracing to hear this evident and yet nuanced form of discrimination from your life. I'm thrilled to introduce tonight the Reverend Dr. Sheldon R. Shipman, who is our neighbor in Hidden Valley and a dear friend of long standing. Reverend Dr. Sheldon Shipman is a motivational speaker. He's a community activist, Afrocentric educator, a senior minister, and a pastor for the past 40 years. He is currently in his 19th year as the pastor of the Greenville Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Charlotte, the denomination known as the Freedom Church, the Church of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Paul Roberson, Booker T. Washington, Harriet Tubman, and Sheldon R. Shipman. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weary. Appreciate that introduction. And thanks to Mayor Jennifer Roberts for the invitation to participate in this wonderful hearing tonight. Let me say I am truly grateful for the comments and testimonies of Daisha Williams, Ebony Lockett, Lakeisha Glover, who I am her former pastor, by the way, and Brother Lawrence Tolliver. Next time, please put me before Ebony and before Lawrence, okay? All right, amen. My experience in Charlotte is a progressive observation of what I affectionately call and critically call the Charlotte Way. The Charlotte Way deals with issues such as social justice and climate change, from police reform to environmental justice. We talk, we set up committees, we do task force, we study, we research, we speak, and then we talk a lot. And in my impression, we do very little after we talk. My progressive observation is simply put, dialogue for the media, selective leadership for marketing purposes, and actions that are agreed upon with meetings that are before the public meeting. Those actions speak loud and clear, benefiting a few, but very rarely benefiting those who are impacted. For the sake of time, let me just start when I was 2 years old. The 1956 Federal Highway Interstate Act began to segregate neighborhoods by dividing Black communities. I-77 and Interstate 85 are perfect examples in Charlotte. Then when I was born, the Housing Act of 1954 started the urban removal projects across America that displaced Black communities and churches, inclusive of our own beloved city, the Queen City. From the Black Wall Street that used to be in the Brooklyn community, including Second Ward, the Good Samaritan Hospital, which is now the home of the Panther Stadium, the devastation of that displacement and the trauma associated with it. The Black community has never fully recovered from those policies, both overt and covert, which is why I believe that we are still 50th on the list of cities with the worst record of upward economic mobility. And I can attest to the fact that both as witnesses and as a person whose family and church family have been affected by it, the hidden effects of environmental justice. In 1972, 48 years ago, I was a college student at UNCC. I attended the old Little Rock AME Zion Church on McDowell Street, where Earl Village was a thriving community. My wife's uncle, Uncle White, who attended Little Rock Church, had a house on McDowell where the post office is located today. Where are the residents of Earl Village and Brooklyn who used to live there? The last remnant of Earl Village is the Carol Hoffner Community Center. And for real connections, if necessary, I would love to introduce you all to some living members of the Brooklyn community who are still members of Little Rock, very good friends of mine. The church that I pastor was located in the old Greenville community off of Statesville Avenue. But due to decisions by local leaders to adhere to progress, capitalism, and I must say white priorities for the community at that time, my congregation didn't move once, but moved twice and ended up in the Hidden Valley community almost 43 years ago. Of course, there is Fairview Homes, Oakland and Statesville Avenue, another Black community divided by Interstate 77. Where are the residents of Double Oaks, Piedmont Courts, Dalton Village off of West Boulevard? Where are they today? It's a good question. How do I explain climate change or environmental justice and racism to my own congregation? The history is complex, but the answer is simple. Environmental racism refers to how minority groups and neighborhoods are burdened with the disproportionate number of hazards, lower the quality of life. This can lead to different diseases and cancers, offering health disparities which accompany food deserts, unemployment, and low income or poverty. Because of this, as the fight for climate change worsens, minority communities will continually to be disproportionately affected. In a study done by Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility, she showed that in 2016, 90% of Congress is white, 96% of the US governors are white. In addition, the top richest Americans are also Caucasians. This tends to perpetuate into policies where environmental racism is sustained under the guise of community development. This situation is simple. When government officials and other individuals and groups in power are faced with the decision of where to place the newest hazardous waste facility or dump site, they typically do not want it to be placed in their backyard, but instead They decide to place these hazardous waste facilities and dump sites in communities filled with people who look like me, who do not look like them, or do not fall in the same tax bracket. My congregation understands this because after being affected by urban removal twice, the location we finally moved into in Hidden Valley, the site that was sold to the former pastor was a dump site, which had been filled and refilled and had to be packed and repacked before the church was issued a permit to build. So yes, the racialization of environmental decision has produced a variety of health disparities, which according to the American Public Health Association, resulting from social determinants such as institutional racism, discrimination, poor access to healthcare and community resources, including redlining and restrictive lending policies based on zip codes and ethnicity. Thus, the reason my church was built on a dump site in 1972, the reason why I will forever be an activist for climate change and environmental justice. I pray that we will continue the legacy of getting into good trouble. In fact, let me make that good green trouble. Continue to be faithful stewards of climate and environmental justice. And I am very positive that the individuals who are on this hearing tonight are the catalysts that are needed for the season that we are living in. I salute all of you. Thank you so much.
Wow. Dr. Shipman, thank you for that phenomenal panoramic historical insight about the economic racializing of communities of color. I wanted to ask you, as a neighbor in the Valley, we're discovering as we build that same dump site situation. I'm wondering what has been the overall impact of these environmental factors that you may have seen in your community's health.
Dr. Weary, I would have to say right up front, the reality of the lack of economic upward mobility for the residents of Hidden Valley. It's not just a written report, it is a true reality that we see on a regular basis. Even from the neighborhood at one point in time being labeled as a fragile neighborhood. Access issues, limited transportation options for being able to get to work or recreation. If you don't have a car, you're in tough luck. Community resources, and we are impacted because it's a food desert. There are no major grocery stores in the area. Unemployment, lack of training opportunities, and then one that was lifted up earlier, sound and air pollution from Interstate 85. That's a pretty good reality that we live with daily.
Do you notice any emotional impact of these problems?
I'll be brief, but mental health issues, psychological trauma, people are disappointed, stress. I've had situations in my own congregation, a young adult a few years ago, so disappointed, committed suicide. I mean, it's the sense of nihilism and just general hopelessness, just feeling a lot of times that your neighborhood voices or the concerns and the conditions are overlooked, unheard, and almost invisible.
Wow. One last, and that is, what do you say your community, our community, needs for environmental justice?
At this point, I would say what we're doing here tonight, not only continue to raise the issue and educate and teach, making the issue much more publicly aware. And I really liked what Dr. Tolliver said, that we need to not only make a plan, incorporate private and public sectors to come together and really implement a plan. If it's if plans were made before to go in the wrong direction, they can certainly bring those same individuals together to go in the right direction. But we have to continue to put a spotlight on it.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Brilliant
Thank
as
you, sir.
always.
Thank you, sir.
Amen. Thank you so very much, Dr. Shipman, Dr. Wary. Reverend Brent Jones, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sadler. Dr. Shipman, I feel your pain about where you were put in the rotation and who you had to follow. Me, little old me having to follow two of the stalwarts of the Hidden Valley community, two men who I look up to greatly, who have sacrificed so much to shed light on the injustices in that community. It is an honor to be able to affirm you, and thank you for this lesson. It's a wonderful lesson for people like myself who do not reside in that community and who are largely unaware of a lot of the injustices that have been forced upon those who live in Hidden Valley and communities like it. Reflecting as you were talking on the fact that you just mentioned the noise pollution. If you look at the stretch between W.T. Harris and Mallard Creek Church Road, you'll see a long noise reduction wall that is on one side next to neighborhoods that are there. And yet on the stretch between W.T. Harris and Sugar Creek, where Hidden Valley is located, there is none, which is interesting because that was originally a white neighborhood. And yet new white neighborhoods have since received these walls, but Hidden Valley today remains exposed to 85. And so it is infuriating. It is discouraging to hear about the persistence of this issue. But it is to know that there are individuals like you who are refusing to be silent. It reminds me of one of the quotes of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., where he says, "For all of us today, the battle is in our hands. The road ahead is not altogether a smooth one. There are no broad highways to lead us easily and inevitably to quick solutions. We must keep going." And so, Dr. Shipman, Dr. Weary, I encourage you, keep going. Keep shining light on this. And may God hear and may he heal our land. And in closing, I'll say, as one man of the cloth to another, we both know that in the law that was given to Israel by Moses, that God made provision for the renewal of the land.
That's right.
In Exodus 23, as well as for the poor in Leviticus 23. And there's a connection there between the land and how God instructed his people to care for the land in such a way as to provide for those who have not. And following the law was supposed to be costly for the Israelites. But unfortunately, we have taken the cost and we have forced it upon those who we are supposed to be caring for. We, speaking for myself, from those who are more privileged. That's not the type of costliness that God wanted, but we have forced that cost onto others. Shame on us. But thank you that there are clarion calls like this. And may you continue, sir, to continue to speak and shine the light brightly on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Amen. Thank you so very much, Dr. Shipman, Dr. Wary, for your work there, and Reverend Jones for that powerful affirmation there. You all are gifts to our larger community, for which I'm happy. Let me also say thank you to each of our impacted witnesses this evening who have shared so much of your soul with us all. We're grateful to you. Our next witness is a confessing witness. A confessing witness is one who is, let me just frankly say, a person who is from a white background, who's recognized the significance of the racialization of our system and has decided to do something with their life to change that around. Mayor Jennifer Roberts is one whose testimony will highlight the patterns of race-based oppression that have fostered disparities from the perspective of one who has not suffered from the harms of environmental racism and injustice. We're joined by my partner in good trouble, the Mayor Jennifer Roberts, who helped found this wonderful organization, the Reimagining America Project. And she's going to tell her own story of recognizing the racial injustice and environmental degradation and pollution in our community. Mayor Roberts, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rodney, and thanks so much to all the storytellers tonight. My heart is full, and I really wanted to be the confessing witness for this subject because I have done so much work on climate change and on the environment, and the justice issue is very real. I confess I grew up in Southeast Charlotte, beautiful tree-lined neighborhood. Healthy air, access to playgrounds. I fell in love with our environment through going on camping trips with the Girl Scouts, through hiking, and never once did I think, wow, there aren't people of color on these hiking trails. Never once did I think, wow, I'm so privileged I don't have to worry about my safety on these hiking trails. Until about 10 years ago, an African-American friend of me told me that he didn't want to go hiking in the woods because he was afraid of the rural white supremacist racist folks who live in our rural areas in North Carolina. He was afraid, and there have been tales of friends of his who had been heckled and threatened for hiking. Thank goodness now when I go to Crowder's Mountain, I see many Black families and Latino families and people from all over hiking there, but it wasn't that way growing up, and I didn't notice. I didn't notice that there were not people of color at the Sierra Club meetings or other environmental organizations I was a part of. I didn't notice they were run by all white people. I didn't think about the fact that some of my colleagues, my friends in high school, when we had integrated schools, were not living in healthy tree-lined neighborhoods, that they had people with asthma in their families, that they lived near the highways. I didn't think about the fact, in fact, today I looked at a map of Mecklenburg County. Where are the landfills? There aren't any in the Wedge in Southeast Charlotte. There is one in Ballantyne, and I remember when I was a county commissioner, it's called the Foxhole. It's just for construction debris. No nasty polluting toxins, no nasty garbage, just wood, concrete, things left over from construction. When we expanded that, all the white people showed up. Like Deja was saying, people with resources, people with means, people who knew how to contact their county commissioners, who knew how government worked, who had the resources, the time, the childcare, etc., to show up for public meetings time and time again. That doesn't happen in Black and brown communities. And it didn't occur to me, I didn't think about the fact that across our state, when you look at the communities near coal ash ponds, near wood pellet, those dirty operations, near hog waste lagoons, if you look at a map and you look at where are the Black and brown communities, all of those facilities are sited right in those communities. Also, before the Clean Water Act, here in Mecklenburg County, companies were dumping toxins straight into our streams and rivers. Little Sugar Creek was a sewer. And during that time of Jim Crow, Black children did not have access to white swimming pools. So where were they playing? In those sewage-filled creeks and streams. I was here in Charlotte. I didn't think about that. I knew that Little Sugar Creek stank. I remember that. But I didn't think about the fact that Black children didn't have access to the white swimming pools. I also didn't think about the health impacts. And when I became a county commissioner, one of the things that we were charged with is public health. If you look now at a CDC map of where are the chronic illnesses in Mecklenburg County, where is the asthma, where is COPD, diabetes, stroke, cancer, where are those the highest? It's in the Crescent. It's in the Crescent. I remember talking about, because I knew what environmental justice was when I was a county commissioner, and I remember talking about greenway expansion, and we want to make sure we're putting greenways in low-income communities because they're transportation, because they're healthy, they have trees, they clear the air and the water. And I remember a state legislator asking me, what's environmental justice? It was a white person. They had no idea. And continue to make policy without taking that into consideration. So I know that our policies of racialization of our environmental health and of the development and building of our communities has had direct impact on health and on wealth accumulation. So if you are forced to live through redlining in those neighborhoods that have landfills and toxins near them, you don't get the household appreciation. You don't get to pass down wealth to your children. There are over, I just read, 3.2 million owner-occupied homes in Black majority neighborhoods across America that have been collectively devalued by $156 billion. This is an ultimate systemic failure. How are we going to have equal opportunity if we don't have any wealth accumulation? I also discovered that until recently, our federal government was denying repair money for Black homeowners who had been flooded out because FEMA was not recognizing heirs property. And so one of the customs in the South, especially in Black families, was to pass down deeds through informal means to try to protect it through what they called heirs property, heirs rights. It was collective ownership. Well, FEMA didn't recognize that. Thank goodness. There was a story this summer in the Washington Post that pointed this out. I just read that in September, FEMA started recognizing, so they can actually give money to help those Black homeowners repair the homes that have been damaged by climate change, by the increasing floods that we're going to continue to see as we get more and more extreme weather. And that goes for urban heat. Our Black and brown neighborhoods were not invested with beautiful tree-lined medians in the middle, like some parts of Charlotte. Habitat homes have not always had trees. The green cover, the park access, so the urban heat is getting worse. And recently, looking at the 2040 vision plan, there was nothing in there about urban heat, nothing in there about mitigating or prioritizing the disinvested areas of our community. We also know that it's so interesting that Deja talked about Warren County. My ancestors, the Watsons, lived in Warren County, and that's where environmental justice movement started. So I love Deja's call to action. I love that we are raising awareness tonight, that more people who look like me, more white people who grew up with the privilege of not worrying about the health of our children and whether they're going to have a chronic illness and whether they were going to survive to adulthood. I never once worried about that. But many of my friends did. The more of us who realize that, the more of us who draw hope from Lawrence's story of people like John Crosland recognizing that we have to restore the soil, we have to restore the land, we have to repair and rebuild in ways that are just. This gives me hope. And I want to close, there's so much more I could mention, but I want to close by saying this is very personal to me. And I got an inheritance from my father from land that he owned, that he loved. It was farmland. The land is so important, that connection to the land that too many minorities and Black and brown communities have not had the luxury of having. So my husband and I have donated all that money to UNC for what is called the Roberts Watson Family Environmental Scholars Program. And we are going to fund 2 students every year, students of color, to have them study environmental sciences. And it's a new department of Earth, Marine, and Environmental Sciences. And I would just encourage anyone listening to think about ways that you, if you are a white person of privilege, that you can also do something to help us improve the environment that gives health, that gives mental health, physical health, that gives us food, that gives us clean water, to restore that access to those Black, Indigenous, people of color communities that for so long, through our policies, were denied it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'm supposed to turn it over now to the Reverend Greg Gerald, but before I do so, I do want to ask you one question. And that might be, what was the source of your cognition, your recognition that you were a white person with privilege? And what helped you to see what so many other people don't see, and got you to be involved in working to change it?
You know, I think I continue to learn. It's been a gradual awakening and a gradual awareness. But when I started hearing friends of mine who were African American talk about how different their lives had been, talk about how different their health had been, when I went to high school graduations as a commissioner for different high schools, and I saw a physical difference in the health of students who are in primarily Black and brown schools, because we have resegregated, unfortunately, how much less healthy they were than the white students in some of our southern high schools who are much healthier. When you can physically see it, when I opened doors campaigning in West Charlotte, in the western side of our city, and I opened the door and I realized this family can't afford air conditioning. They're energy burdened. And this is hurting their health. Too much heat, children learn less, there's more aggression. So the gradual awareness, being in public service, being exposed, listening to people's stories like we're doing tonight.
Well, I thank you for that, Mayor Roberts. I want to call you Reverend Roberts. Reverend Gerald, I turn this over to you, my brother.
All right. Good evening, folks. Reverend Greg Gerald. Jennifer, to you, briefly, I just want to say thank you for the words that you have offered, for the courage to acknowledge your own shortcomings, your own short-sightedness, and the willingness to offer us a glimpse of how you've come to see things differently. A process that, especially for those of us who have been called white, is a long and ongoing process of waking up to the world around us. To the rest of our witnesses this evening, Daisha, Ebony, Nikisha, Lawrence, and Sheldon, and also to you, Jennifer, I want to thank you for the way that you have helped us to get a clear vision of the nature of environmental racism and the way that it is contextualized within our city, so that this is not a big and abstract problem, but it is a real problem that that affects our community institutions, that affects families and neighbors within our city. I want to thank you for your commitment to sticking with this work and in the various ways that you're doing it. Certainly, it can be discouraging and disappointing at times and requires much persistence, and so I'm grateful for that. I also want to thank you for your imagination. Our work here together in the Reimagining America project is first and foremost to stop having our imaginations held captive by the empire. And so for your insistence that we can reimagine the way that our world has been constructed and that we can live better together as kindred with one another, I am grateful for that. So I leave here a little hopeful and grateful to have served along with you all tonight and for where we're headed.
Amen. Amen. I just want to say thank you to everyone tonight who participated in this program. Reverend Gerald, you summed it up quite well with the thanks to each and every one of the witnesses, each and every one of the commissioners, that have worked on this. I also want to say thank you to Erin for her production skills, for Maddie for her production of this event tonight, for Ryan for all that he's done to help us bring this hearing together. You all have done such a fabulous job, and for which I'm incredibly grateful. As a matter of housekeeping, if you have time tonight, those who participated, we want to invite you to a parking lot conversation afterwards. There's a note that's come to you in your email to let you know how to join that conversation. So please join us there so that we can debrief. There also will be a follow-up hearing or follow-up opportunity to have a discussion about this hearing so that we can dig deeper, we can find out recommendations, and we can move forward with making sure that the voices of those who've spoken will continue to be amplified. Grateful to everyone who's joined us tonight to hear this, and for those of you who will listen to it on recording later on. This has truly been a wonderful opportunity to learn about what it is to be involved in environmental justice, the impact on climate, and the way that we need to worry about our larger environment. Black and brown people continue to be impacted at a much higher rate by what's going on with our environment than others are. And because of this, we need to attend to these issues as we continue to work towards a new future, one beyond race, one in where we're all treated equally, one in where God's justice is done for every one of God's children created in God's image. Grateful to you all for all that you continue to do as we work to reimagine America and make a better future for us all. We're going to close our conversation tonight with a prayer from my dear colleague, the Reverend Dr. Jim Beard. Jim, I turn it over to you as we close. God bless you all.
Let us pray. Dear Lord and Creator of all that we see, hear, and touch, we ask that what we have done here tonight be blessed by you and used to further the cause of justice. We know you created all of this world and that we as your children often treat your creation with disregard. Help us to understand that we can't keep one part of your creation whole while bringing destruction on other parts. We are all in this world together. Let us see that producing cleanliness and purity in one place while causing filth and pollution in others is unjust and an affront to you, O Lord. Give us wisdom, give us compassion, give us courage that we might be your faithful servants in environmental justice. And may you, the God who loves us all, go with us. Amen. Shalom.
Amen. Amen. Thank you for that wonderful prayer. None of us here today is the cause of the injustices that we've talked about, but all of us is responsible to do something about it. Thank you, Jennifer, for your work putting this together tonight. God bless you all.